head of knowledge center and community and market development, will join us in a little bit. Our intention for today is to provide you really with an exclusive learning opportunity on one side, but also really use this opportunity that we're here together as members of EVPA to connect to each other in a smaller, more intimate setting, and really to get to know also other members of EVPA who are interested in investing for development. So I'd like to share the agenda and what we have in mind for today with you. So here you go. We'll have, so we'll spend the next two and a half hours together. In the first part, we'll have the wonderful input session by our lead practitioners, combined with short breakout sessions with your peers, the speakers, and our EVPA colleagues. We'll have a 10-minute break at around 11:10, a little bit after 11 o'clock. And in the second part, we intend to have a sort of virtual fishbowl, which allow you to interact really with our lead practitioners and the participants more closely. We will close at 12:30, ideally. But then we thought it may be a nice opportunity, since we are all here together, to really, for everybody to grab some coffee and lunch, and then continue for another 15 or 20 minutes or so with an informal chat, if you like. I'd like to also make some suggestions on technical issues. It would be great if you could just ensure that your profile shows your name and that of your organization. It makes it a little bit easier to see who you are. We'd also like to invite you to make use of the chat function for questions or comments. And as you may have noticed, we are recording the inputs and the fishbowl session. If you don't want to be seen, then please switch off your camera. For the fishbowl later on, it would be great if you could activate the function hide non-video participants. For that, you go to Zoom preferences, into settings, and in the video function, and there you can activate the hide non-video participants, so that we can, in the fishbowl, we'll then later have a sort of plenary session. I'd like to introduce you to our wonderful speakers, and actually I've known most of you for very long time, and it's a really great pleasure for all to have you all here in the same room today with us. I start with Peter Nicholas, who's a director at for international development at Social Finance UK, and Social Finance is a really long-standing member with EVPA, very engaged, but also a pioneer on innovative financing mechanisms, and particularly the social impact bonds that you really helped to develop in the UK as well as globally. Also with us, there should be Maximilian Martin. Has he arrived by now? Has he come? Not yet. We hope he will still join us later today. So Maximilian, also his work I really admire. He's shaped what he called the impact economy for more than a decade. I really like the term of an impact economy as well. And he's now a global head of philanthropy, and he will talk to us about humanitarian bonds. And I'm really looking forward to that discussion as well. We have Björn Struve with us today. Welcome very much. Björn used to be an investment banker by background, then with Ashoka moved into the impact space. He co-founded FASE, the Financial Agency for Social Entrepreneurship, also a long-standing member of EVPA, set up the Social Finance Academy to educate social entrepreneurs on financing issues, and then pioneered the concept of social impact incentives and impact-linked finance. which he will introduce to us today. So welcome, Björn, as well. And it's probably not surprising that Björn and Peter Beetz from the Swiss Development Corporation are here together. The Swiss Development Corporation is doing a lot of great work in emerging countries. But also Peter very much, and the Swiss Development Corporation very much supported Björn on his journey on developing the concept and piloting the concept of social impact incentives and impact-linked finance. And yes, it has been a very fruitful collaboration between the two agencies. So welcome, Peter, to this session as well. We'd like to get to know you as well. So would you kindly share with us, why are you here today with us? What do you hope to understand and learn as part of this program? Or are you just here to see your friends? Please let us know what brought you here. If you can use the chat function for that, that would be great. Just take a few seconds.
I can start. My name is Andrei Andrusov. I'm from Moscow, Russia. And we are launching an impact fund this year, and I just trying to learn all these new things. For learning since last, I don't know, 3 years in this sphere, and trying not to miss any opportunities to learn new stuff, especially from EVPA. And then, yes, and see some friends.
And see some friends. That's wonderful. Andrei, thank you very much for your contribution. If I could ask everybody to just put their motivation in the chat, because in that way also we'll save some time and we can have it all in the chat and then better understand who is actually in the room and what motivates you really to be there. Thank you very much for your contribution. So we have Penelope from SOS Group, and you're a new member indeed. You just joined recently, and you're looking forward to learning about innovative finance and getting the experience from others on outcome-based finance. So there is certainly some opportunities also for SOS Group to implement that, especially with the International Action Branch. Thank you very much for that contribution. While we wait for others to comment on that, could I ask Florian maybe to launch two more questions on really so that we understand who is in the room and where you're coming from.
Exactly. Thank you very much, Anja. I will just launch, as Anja said, 2 questions to test a little bit the waters, to see who is in the room, and also for you to get a little bit of a feeling of this group today. So I will launch a first question that should appear on your screen. Should do so right now, hopefully. If not, please let me know. But the question in any case would be, how much do you know already about the topic of outcome-based finance? You're complete new, you've heard or read a little bit about it, you've been already involved, and you're an expert. So let's see. Some votes coming in. I'll give you some more seconds. But I think there is a tendency. Yes, so the majority, I will end the polling and I will show you the results. So there are no newbies. That's good. So there is a lot to exchange among us. Some of you already heard about our topic, some read about it, some are already involved, and 2 are already experts. So that's good to have a diverse group. So that's wonderful. I will just launch a second question in a second. And here we are. So the question is, what is or what would be the role of your organization? So we are a potential, or we already are results-based or outcome grant funder. We are a potential investor. We are intermediaries. We are impact delivery organization or other. So let's see what kind of organizations we have in the room. Votes are coming in. I'll give you some more seconds, but make sure to cast your vote. And I think we have a representative result, which I'll share with you. So we have the big majority are intermediaries, but again, we have a variety of people in the room, a variety of organizations. So that's good. That's exactly what we were looking for, to have a fruitful exchange among each other. So thanks a lot for this quick exercise, and I'll hand over to Anja back again.
Thanks a lot. Just before we hear from our speakers, I just like to provide a brief introduction into the topic of result-based finance, which really sets the stage and provide a little bit of a context on what we're talking about. So result-based finance and outcome-based finance is part of that. I think it's really fair to say it is on the rise, and that is in the context of increased focus on aid effectiveness, public-private partnerships, and market-based approaches. So you can really see some milestones here in 2003 with the launch of the Global Partnership on outcome-based, output-based aid, the World Bank's program for results that was launched in 2011, and the launch of the first development impact bonds in 2015. What is result-based finance? Basically, it encompasses a variety of mechanisms, but it is really about linking finance to predetermined results and payments, and then the payment is linked to the verified delivery of these results. The advantages are pretty obvious. There's a focus on outputs and outcomes rather than in inputs. The funders only pay for achievement of agreed results, and there's more flexibility for service providers on how results are being achieved. But there are also some concerns, at least with the first generation of some of the result-based contracts, that the service providers basically have to source their own working capital that they use in order to invest in their solution before they actually get paid. There is also the question around risk. Is it really fair and feasible that the providers can take the full delivery risk? And that is certainly an issue when you have NGOs, for example, providing the service. You don't want them to go bankrupt if something goes wrong later on and then cease to exist. That is obviously also not desirable. So as I said, the result-based finance encompasses a large variety of mechanisms, and you can really see the difference here between them. I listed a couple of criteria that you can use to distinguish them, and one of the first criteria is about distinguishing the output versus the outcome orientation. There's also difference who you incentivize with your mechanisms. It can be a public sector, a government even, that is incentivized by the donor. It can be a market-based organization, social, or a household. It can be depending on whether you involve a private investor or not, and a couple of other criteria. Just briefly to sum this up and also talk a little bit about these criteria and how they developed over time. We can see that with result-based finance, there's actually a movement from ex post payment upon delivery to ex ante provision of at least part of the upfront capital. It is also very much about monetizing and valuing the outcomes as such, rather than just subsidizing services as used to be under output-based aid contracts in the early generation. Also, I already mentioned with the risk allocation, it's interesting to see how more the risk allocation becomes more sophisticated in these contracts. It's not 100% of one agent only, but really across different agents. And it is also, there is a trend that we see very clearly about using these mechanisms to mobilize new private investment capital. But they also come from new players such as angel investors, TFIs, and corporates. Also, what is very important, the first contracts used to be small pilot deals, very high transaction costs, and now we're observing a move towards more programmatic structures and pooled outcome funds, and we'll hear more about this in a minute. There's also something about the competitive selection of the impact delivery organizations or service providers. And we can also see that there's so much more learning happening and guidance material really available on all these mechanisms. So without, I just thought this could be quite useful to put the presentations that we're going to hear in a little bit more of a context. And I'd now like to ask Peter Nicholas to take us a little bit through the concept of impact bonds in result-based finance. And while Peter is opening it, so we really welcome any comments that you have, any questions that may arise during the presentation. Please just put them into the chat.
Great, thank you. Can everyone see the screen?
Can you put it to presentation mode, please?
Yeah, sorry, just a moment. Is that better?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay,
Perfect.
Great. Sorry, thank you. So as Anya says, I will talk through a bit about impact bonds and outcome funds. I'm going to try and aim the presentation at people who are relatively new to the topics, who have some familiarity but want to learn more. So I know that some of you are probably more expert than me on impact bonds and outcome funds. So you may want to go and make a cup of coffee or something for the next 10 minutes. But for the others, I just wanted to start by briefly summarizing three major types of outcome-based finance. There's traditional results-based finance, which goes back more than 20 years and assumes, as Anya says, that service providers will be able and willing to carry the working capital requirement and the risk of financing activities until hopefully outcome payments are forthcoming. In contrast, impact bonds, which have emerged over the last 10 years, move the burden of providing the risk capital to large external investors who can be from the private or the public sectors. The presence of these large external investors frees outcome funders to focus more on a project's outcomes, its ultimate result, rather than on more intermediate outputs. Typically, in traditional RBF outcome traditionally, RBF outcome funders do not want to put an undue working capital risk on service providers who may well have neither the available capital nor the experience to take on that sort of risk. So impact bonds come in three main forms: social impact bonds, or SIBs, where the outcome funder is a national government or other domestic funder; development impact bonds, or DIBs, where the outcome funder is external to the country, for example, a donor or a global foundation; and humanitarian impact bonds, or HIBs, which we'll hear about later, where the objective is more humanitarian than purely developmental. And lastly, outcome funds, which we'll also talk about later. These bring together funding from different sources to create a pooled fund available to support a range of results-based projects. So turning to impact bonds in a bit more detail, a key element of impact bonds is the financial incentives for the investors. So whether they lose money or just get barely repaid or make a profit. These incentives depend on the degree to which, these rewards depend on the degree to which they manage to generate independently measured results. So they are incentivized by the need to achieve outcomes, and the degree of to which they get their money back or make a small profit is dependent on the degree to which they manage to fulfill the agreed outcome metrics. Because the risk is borne by investors, the outcome funders only specify the desired results, not exactly how the investors should receive those results, or should achieve those results, within, of course, normal fiduciary rules. This frees investors to manage the project, through a project manager typically, in a way that is unconstrained by bureaucratic or log frame rigidities, and can adapt program implementation, and indeed program design, to data on what is working well and what isn't. Clearly, investors and outcome funders have different financial interests. Investors want to get repaid with hopefully a reasonable return on capital, whereas outcome funders want to ensure that they don't pay for results that have not been genuinely achieved. For this reason, almost all impact bonds involve an independent external verification agent who determines whether agreed outcomes really have been achieved or not, and therefore whether payment is made from outcome funders to the investors. Now, this slide shows a simplified, or at least typically simplified, flow of funds in an impact bond. At the top, the investors put risk capital into the project. This risk capital is typically managed by a DIB manager who is responsible for day-to-day management of the service provision. This management is done through a contract between the DIB manager and a service provider or several service providers. Because investors want an adaptive management approach that maximizes the chances of successful outcomes, the contracts with service providers typically require much more regular data flow from the service providers and the resulting course corrections than is typical in a development project or indeed in any project. As I mentioned, an independent entity measures whether success has been achieved or not, and on that basis pays, or if the project fails, doesn't pay the investors. So in summary, the benefits of impact bonds are that they move the risk to entities that are well able, indeed willing, to take on that risk. They also incentivize adaptive management and prudent risk-taking, because the traditional log frame model is replaced by one in which investors want quick adaptation as new data becomes available, and also to collect that data in as close to real time as possible. I won't go through this slide in detail, and if of interest, we can come back to it later during the discussion. But this shows the objectives and the roles and some examples of who they typically are of the 5 key players in an impact bond. So you have partner governments who may also be outcome funders, but may not be if the outcome funder is an external donor, as in a typical development impact bond or DIB. You have the investors who pay up front and drive the results and hopefully introduce innovation and risk. You have the service providers who obviously provide the on-the-ground service delivery. And then, of course, you have the beneficiaries who hopefully are the key data point in an impact bond, the place where data is collected, for the people from whom, or rather, data is collected, is analyzed, and is then used to iteratively and hopefully quickly improve the delivery of the impact bond as more information becomes available about what's working and what isn't. Then this slide shows the way that an impact bond works in one specific case. This example is from the Palestine Finance for Jobs project. And I think we're lucky to have on the call Khadija from EBRD, who was one of the main driving forces behind this impact bond and knows more about it than I do.
Peter, can you move a little bit closer to the microphone? It seems like there's something
sure.
changed compared to, yes, that's much better. Thank you so much.
This example, as I say, is from Palestine. The outcome funder is the Palestinian Authority with funding from the World Bank, and the investors are EBRD, the Dutch DFI, FMO, and 2 Palestinian social investors. The purpose of the impact bond is to provide high quality skills training that meets employers' real world needs, as opposed to maybe the needs that were imagined some years before by the training providers. Because there are multiple investors, the capital is pooled into a special purpose vehicle, SPV, that manages the funds for the investors, and through a DIB manager, oversees the service providers supplying the skills training to Palestinian youth in this case. Outcome payments are made by the World Bank in agreement with the Palestinian Authority through a project implementation agency. A key element of the way that outcomes are formulated is that the skills training providers have to get their trainees into sustained employment, defined as more than 6 months, at which point they become permanent under Palestinian law and difficult and expensive to fire. So this outcome metric, which is necessary, the achievement of which is necessary for investors to make a profit, this outcome metric of employment beyond 6 months shows that the employees are genuinely valued and not just kept on because of a temporary subsidy or apprenticeship program or whatever, which sometimes happens in more traditional skills training programs. One of the interesting results of making this sustained employment a key outcome metric, rather than maybe the traditional training completion or job starts, is that it has motivated skills training providers to form alliances with employers to make sure that the training they provide really is what the employers want. The need for trainees to be employed past the 6-month cutoff has furthermore incentivized the training providers to continue to have a longer term horizon that extends beyond the training itself. Now turning briefly to outcomes funds. As I mentioned at the beginning, outcome funds pool development finance so that it can fund multiple outcome-based programs. This has several advantages. It ensures economies of scale because it allows several funders to support multiple transactions over a number of years. It also has another significant advantage in that anyone wanting funding for outcomes-based projects has to bid competitively for the funding. And this helps to ensure that the outcome funds has optimal cost effectiveness and impact. Outcomes fund can also be tailored so that they fund a particular sector or a particular geography, which helps to ensure high quality sectoral or geographic expertise can be cost effectively focused on the fund. Lastly, outcome funds can tackle complex problems where adaptive management of the sort we've discussed is needed to make sustained, cost effective progress. This slide provides an example of an outcomes fund in real life, in this case, the Education Outcome Fund. This fund aims to improve education quality by paying only for measurable outcomes, for example, improvements in literacy and numeracy. The fund has significant ambitions for scale, specifically to raise and deploy $1 billion for improved learning. In the flowchart, you'll see that a combination of developing country governments and donor outcome funders support the EOF. The EOF defines the success metrics which will determine outcome payments. And on this basis, impact investors provide upfront capital to the service providers and then receive outcome payments if and when the agreed outcome metrics are achieved. As a sort of mirror image of outcome funds, which are on the grant payment side, there are also outcome investment funds, which are sort of a mirror image. These investment funds likewise pool funding and ensure financing and can ensure financing only for high quality well-vetted impact bonds through the pooled availability of money. And because the money is pooled, it enables impact bonds to be launched more quickly and with less administrative overhead, because you already have a single structure available which can be drawn on to finance multiple impact bonds. So you're not constantly recreating the legal and administrative frameworks to invest in those impact bonds. And it allows particular funds to be created which match the investors' desire for a strong social mission. And this can be across different sectors and geographies, like with the outcome fund. So it enables investors to focus on the geographies or the sectors where they're most interested. And this flowchart provides an idea of how an outcome investment fund works. As you'll see, the outcome investment fund potentially invests in a whole series of impact bonds. And in this case, we're talking with the example we're using here is nutrition, where a nutrition outcome fund will then use its pooled funding to provide outcome payments if the impact bonds to succeed across multiple impact bonds. So here in this example, you have both an outcome investment fund pooling investment and an outcomes fund pooling the outcome funding, which can be used to pay for the success of any or all of the impact bonds which are successful. So I'll close there, and obviously happy to discuss any of this further during the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter. Also, thank you, dear participants, for the questions that you asked. Really interesting questions. I'd just like to pick one or two, and we can then also talk about it in more detail during the fishbowl. But there was a question, and I'd like to combine two questions here. There was one question on the level of returns that investors would expect in such a transaction. And who are typically those investors? Are they only philanthropic investors, or could there also be more commercially driven investors? So just maybe combining those two questions.
Sure. I mean, the return to investors depends a lot on the level of risk and the type of investors that are investing. But it would often be in the high single digits IRR for achievement of key agreed results, and then maybe a bit higher than that if results are overachieved up to some cap. But with the sort of full achievement of project objectives could in many cases be in the high single digits, but as I say, it varies. In terms of investors, we've seen a very wide variety. We've seen major multilateral institutions like EBRD investing, bilaterals like FMO. We've also seen social investors, investors who are in the private sector profit making, but have an explicit social mandate. For example, the two Palestinian investors in the Palestinian impact bond. And we've also seen in some cases foundations who, in the current environment of low guaranteed returns on investment, are interested in using both their endowment, but both the income on their endowment for social purposes and also the endowment itself. So a lot of the early impact bonds in the UK were financed by the Barrow Cadbury Trust, which was seeing relatively low returns on its endowment, and therefore sort of win-win in investing in an impact bond which would allow its endowment to contribute to social purposes, but also hopefully make a higher return than it did on its existing portfolio, which I wouldn't be telling the story if they hadn't achieved that. But so for them, it was a double win.
Thanks so much, Peter. That's really interesting. And there were two more questions that I found extremely interesting. One, or two questions rather, on impact measurement and management and the flexibility in times of crisis. And the other one about the evaluation of the evaluators and how we can be sure that the results that are verified, that there's not a misuse about this. But I'd like to park this question for the time being and put this into the fishbowl section, because I think this is a question that certainly will come up also in relation to the other structures. And the second area that I think it was yours to ask the question about the ecosystem of service provider in relation to the capacity also of the service provider that emerged, or whether there would be now an ecosystem of service providers that are emerging in view of the rise of result-based financing mechanisms. And there's certainly also quite some experience to be shared on how to provide support to the service providers so that they are actually able to deliver the impact that they promise. And I think this has been also a significant part of the West Bank example. But I also like to park that question to the fishbowl section, and now move on to our breakout sessions, where I'd like to ask you to introduce yourself to each other and share what insights in those two presentations that you heard most resonated with you and why, and whether there may be any more questions that you like to ask. So I'd like to ask Florian to put us in different breakout groups, and also the speakers will be with you in these breakout groups.
Exactly. Thank you very much. I will open the breakout rooms. You will be in groups of 2 or 3. So I open them now. You should see a pop-up on your screen, and you just follow the link.
Florian, do you also want me to join?
No, not
probably not.
No, and me, you want me to join my group or not really? It's group 5.
Yes.
I'll go.
And Alex is by himself. Do we find a group for Alex still?
Yes.
Oh, he's disappeared now.
All right.
Okay, so
I'll pause the recording.
As a result of conflict. Now, when you think about where to apply results-based financing, I think we immediately come to the point that was raised earlier. We do need data, because it's very difficult to price risk and condition payouts based on success if we do not have any data. And therefore, we agreed with ICSC to focus on a field that they've been active in since 1979, and that is physical rehabilitation. The ICSC today is running over 140 centers, basically dealing with people who unfortunately have lost a limb because of a landmine or because of malnutrition and diabetes, and offer mobility services. There's a lot of experience and a lot of data accumulated in this space. If we go to the next slide, we then said, okay, of course, results-based financing is first and foremost about delivering more value for money, better results, as was also mentioned before. How would you do that? And then we go to the next slide. The idea here was quite simple, to say, okay, if you do feasibility studies, which we did, and you look at these centers, you realize a certain disparity in terms of labor productivity. So per healthcare worker, some centers are very effective, a lot of value for money, others are less so. And then the question is, of course, if that's the case, why is that the case? You know, it's not that people are incompetent per se, but these are difficult environments. And we found that there's certain best practices in so-called lead centers where you would say you'd want every center to work in these ways. But we also found that there are certain, I would say, step change opportunities in terms of labor productivity associated to the introduction of practices such as electronic enterprise or digital enterprise management at the center level. You need to manage the resources, you can do that better.
or introducing, for example, electronic patient records. So really the benefits of digitalization and business process redesign as you would have in a factory, excuse my analogy here. And we said, okay, if this hypothesis is that you could actually raise productivity, efficiency of the centers very significantly, if you build new centers, greenfield, your next generation centers, the question is then who pays for that exercise? And at what scale do you need to do it in order for it to be meaningful? One thing's clear, you can't just do it in a single site, because you might have an idiosyncratic development where a war erupts again, you can't really run the center, so you need a pool or portfolio of centers, and we agreed on setting for three centers, but you also want some comparability across these centers. So we said, well, let's not put them in different world regions, but all of them in sub-Saharan Africa. In this case, the DRC, Mali, and Nigeria. And then comes the point, who's going to pay for this? The studies indicated that a labor productivity increase of 80% is in principle possible in the best case scenario. And then of course, some people said, well, with an 80% upside, why doesn't the ICC pay for this themselves out of their current budget? There isn't any point in structuring a complex instrument. But the reality is that we're in the business of innovation, and it takes 5 years. You need to first build the center, it takes about 2 to 3 years. Open it, then run it for a certain amount of time until you get up, I would say, to the steady state where it runs as it would subsequently, where you can really measure. And this is a timeline that is not well aligned with the typical budgeting of ICRC that runs through annual appeals. And this is where the rationale for outcomes-based financing, in fact, a social impact bond logic comes in. So we said, okay, there are parties to the ICRC that are interested in seeing more efficient centers. Those are typical donor governments who are already supporting the ICRC. And in those cases, 4 participated: Switzerland, Italy, Belgium, and the UK. And also, as one of the outcome funders, the Spanish foundation, Fundación La Caixa. I don't know if La Caixa is here today, but fantastic that they participated in this. So that the idea was to say they will buy the result. If these 3 centers come on stream and treat 5,000 patients a year in year 5 in a way that's up to 80% more efficient, that has a huge amount of value because they will be funding this kind of work anyway, the bilateral donors. Then you need to raise, of course, the financing to pre-finance that and to structure it. We agreed that we would not create a special purpose vehicle. Why? Because the ICRC has immunities. The reality is you couldn't sue the ICRC anyway if you wanted to on certain things because it has privileges because of international law. So it's actually a better and more cost-efficient way to run this as a segregated project with segregated accounts under the ICRC, but create an operating committee. We meet at least twice a year and get quarterly updates. I serve for the bank on the operating committee. And ultimately be very clear and say simplistic on what we'll measure as results, because it's complex, it's inside the organization, it's not segregated, so simplicity is king. The way it was then structured was to say, well, it also needs to be attractive for the investors. So, together with the ICRC, we raised the funding for this on the Lombardodier side, and with one anchor investor that's part of Munich Re, New Re Insurance. And basically these investors paid in the equivalent of 18.6 million Swiss francs if it works. And we're now in year 4, so I'll be able to tell you basically in the late summer of next year if it worked, but so far it looks pretty okay in spite of COVID, which is surprising but positive. They will get a total upside of up to 34.5%. Against a possible total drawdown of 40% if it doesn't work at all, if we fail completely, which we won't because things are already, some things have already been done. And how is the downside structured? Essentially, the way the downside is structured is that the outcome funders say, okay, we'll at any rate pay for half, so the investors could lose up to 50%. But it's important for us that ICRC has skin in the game as well, so they would pick up another 10% if it doesn't work. This limits the downside to 40%. How is the upside structured? The upside is structured according to sliding scale. that will be measured in year 5, according to a formula that I'll go into in a second. And since many of our clients like liquidity, we sort of artificially created liquidity through a 2% coupon that is paid 4 times. But really, at the end of the day, when everything is in, all the information is in, we will know if the investment has been in the money or not. And this is predetermined according to a sliding scale that conditions the payout as a function of the efficiency improvement. I will, the investment features on the next slide, but I think we need to be brief. So in value proposition, I think I can go to as well subsequently. Let's go maybe to slide 9. So this staff efficiency ratio, because I think that's really important also following the discussion that we had earlier. I would say our conviction here is to say, of course, there'll be very significant knock-on effects of this transaction for the ICSC and for the beneficiaries more broadly. Because you imagine, someone, for example, gets mobility services, gets a wheelchair, gets a prosthesis and so on, prosthesis, they will become, actors in society again. So it's really powerful, and there are knock-on benefits, but it's very difficult for us to measure those. And we didn't really want to make value judgments that can then be challenged from an auditing point of view. So we said we'll keep it very, very simple. We'll simply focus on basically who is working in these centers, what is their level of training, and there are 3 types of essentially professionals with different weights in the formula. And then also, what's the value add, so to speak, the patient value add of the 3 main interventions in these centers, and those are wheelchairs, orthoses, and prosthesis. And then, of course, you need to normalize this because we're talking about 3 different countries with different working hours, essentially, with a working hours ratio, so you get a comparable formula. This is very simple, and this is really just the core of the conditioning of the payout of this transaction. It's on purpose. Yes, there are other knock-on benefits, and I'd like to cover 2 of those right now, but those are not captured. One other knock-on benefit is, as you may imagine, for this, a new digital platform had to be programmed to capture patient data, and a new, say, enterprise management system had to be developed. I mean, when you run as an organization 140 centers, of course you will use the new system that you have, it's IT-based, in other centers as well. So that's a knock-on benefit that isn't, capitalized here, or it isn't captured here, but it's real and it's demonstrable. And secondly, I would say, and there's a more indirect benefit from a positioning value, it was important for ICSC to start piloting in a serious way the goal to diversify funding and start with impact or social investments. And you need to start somewhere. This is an area that lends itself to outcomes-based financing for the simple reason that there is data dating back to 1979. You can keep it simple and still deliver value add that is measurable. 80% is not nothing. But if I look at the other benefits to the organization today, it has been, for example, informing a new strategy so that now there is actually a formal goal to run these kinds of instruments by 2030. That is very ambitious. And secondly, I would say perception of donors. ICC has managed to position itself as an innovative player in this space. And now, to anticipate some criticism that may come from yourselves, I've heard that a number of times. People said, you guys are really greedy, so you structure something at 34.5% upside for investors. But then I have to say, wait a second, if you're an outcome funder, first of all, we're talking about really difficult countries. There's a significant risk that the investors need to take. And secondly, the total result that is now being purchased in the best case scenario by the investor, by the outcome funders, for 26 million Swiss francs would have cost 33.48 million Swiss francs. So it's a very significant saving over the model, just in a comparative static logic. This is not factoring in the dynamic benefits I just mentioned. So we think it's fair from a pricing point of view. And very importantly, we think it's important to do it like that, because if we are in the logic of, I would say, artificially low financial returns and high impact, it's very, very difficult to repeat such transactions or offer them on a grander scale. because you can always find a couple of clients or investors who want to be sub-market, but that pool is by definition quite limited. And maybe if we go to the next slide very quickly, I just want to share a couple of learnings here from the implementation. This is also in one of the articles that Anya has kindly put in the resource section of your document. How did this work and why did it work? I would say we were in the business of pure innovation at the time. It worked because we were able to jointly identify a program that is really strategic to the organization and can be taken to a next level. This is not the case for all programs. We need to be honest about that. Secondly, a lot of parties were involved internally. You need to get input. You can't just shove this down people's throats and force them to do it because it changes the way of working. It worked because it was very participatory. I personally, you'll tell me if you agree, I think an attractive part is that the impact measurement is simple because everyone understands it, including the auditor. And identifying auditors is very difficult for this. We wanted initially a big four law firm, but then actually found out that their staff policies prevent them from visiting the centers because of the risk. It's not so easy to send people to Maiduguri, North Nigeria, courtesy of neighborhood with Boko Haram, for example, or to Mali, at the construction site, we had some decommissioned fighters for a while. Not fun, right? So you need to find a specialist firm that is good enough as an auditor, but at the same time can do the job. And then very importantly, there was senior engagement, both on the side of ICC, on the side of Lombardier, and certainly also on the side of Munich Re, the anchor investor. You will always find in any organization, when you want to do something new, a lot of people who think this is a very stupid idea and who want to shut it down before it comes to fruition. We all had this at several moments as well, all the organizations involved, I think. But we managed to overcome that because at that point in time, you need to come to your senior support and say, this is a moonshot idea. We want to make it happen. Please back me up. And then, of course, I think this is one of the learnings. It's a successful example of multiple parties collaborating on the outcome funding and investment side. And we see this in the operating committee, a very collegial environment. I think something we can build on for the future. Finally, I'd like to say, this is a relatively large transaction. We are not interested in smaller impact bonds because we think it's a subsidy game anyway. It's very expensive. So you want to do it at a certain scale. But if you want to work at scale, you need time. You need to do the feasibility studies, you need to identify the strategic interest, create the alignment. And my recommendation would be, if you want to do these more ambitious, larger programs, give yourself the time you need. And maybe just two quick conclusions on the next slide and the subsequent, maybe the next slide first. If we now want to transition from a one-time moonshot, we'll know whether it was successful in June 2022. So far, it looks pretty okay. To a repeatable way of working, we need to take a pipeline view. And the pipeline view is, certainly in my view, capacity is the main constraint. Outcome funding as well, and capacity probably, because you need a certain level of sophistication inside international organizations on these topics. It's a staffing issue. You need to invest money, costs money, and they need to be able to interface well with the other senior members of the organization. That's something one needs to work on. In fact, we're working on building actually a training program with IMD on doing just that. I'm happy to share more info on that once we're there. So I think this is a critical constraint next to outcome funding. And then maybe next slide, the next slide. We think that COVID-19, because it's created such a dent into the achievement of development outcomes and the incrementation of need, will actually accelerate the need for innovation and, I would say, demonstrate the value for money. So we actually think that in a convoluted way, this is probably an opportunity to become more ambitious, also about the, I would say, organizational changes that need to happen in the development finance space, in the international organization space, and certainly also in the banking space or financial institution space, to jointly build larger, high impact transactions of this nature going forward. So that's it from me, and I hope I haven't overstayed my welcome, Anya, because you asked me to be brief.
Thank you so much, Max. That was excellent and also very rich and one could really feel your and see your enthusiasm for this project, which clearly shows to us. Thank you very much for sharing your passion with us, as well as the many interesting pieces of information that will be very useful, and also for opening up our perspective on what this one transaction could possibly mean for us in the future. We have two questions here on what happens if it doesn't work, and you touched a little bit on it. What does it mean for the social investor, but also what does it mean for the implementing organization? And the second question was on external support to ICRC to increase the center's productivity, or whether they improve their performance internally. I would, in view of time, I would suggest that we put these two questions also to the parking lot, because they match quite well with the earlier question that who was it? Joost asked about the ecosystem of service providers and the organization's capacity. So that could be one thematic block. And in relation to what happens if it doesn't work, I think that also fits quite well into the question on impact measurement and impact evaluation. So we'll also discuss about this in the fishbowl round. I hope that this is okay for those who asked the question. I'd like to invite you now to take a 7-minute break until 11:25 and be back here by 11:25. We'll then hear about the very exciting mechanism of impact-linked finance by Björn and Peter, and we'll move again into breakout groups, and then we'll have the fishbowl discussion to really go into discussion about these areas that we already identified now in the first two presentations. So thank you very much. I see you back here at 11:25, please. Thank you so much. Welcome back, everybody. I'd now like to hand over directly to Peter Beetz and Björn Struber to take us and introduce us to the concept of impact-linked finance.
Thank you very much, Anja. So let me start. If you remember the slides that Anja has shown us, and as well Peter, the slide where you have this cloud of these different approaches, now where the axis was from input to outcome impact, and Y1 was on players from state and then beyond to private sector actors. We are now in the upper right corner with impact-linked finance, SYNC, social impact incentives, and in fact we already did some kind of outcome fund here. So we are talking about impact-linked finance, better terms for better impact. What kind of finance do need high impact enterprises to scale and optimize their impact? So we are talking about the private sector, private players, and Björn, next slide. And what we see here is that there is a problem. You have a double bottom line of these enterprises. They want to manage their financials, of course, their financial value, but they are talking about impact, social value as well. Let me give you an example. If you're selling cook stoves or solar home systems or water filters or whatever you do to poor people in rural areas in Africa, for instance, there are certain parameters you cannot influence, and the financial value of selling these things is given. Let's say you sell your cook stove for $20, which is a fantastic investment for the poor people, but they can't pay more than $20. However, they have personally, individually, a huge social value out of it because they save every month, let's say $5 or $10 a month for charcoal or wood or collecting wood or whatever you want to count. So there's a huge social value which the social enterprise cannot capture. The market is not giving it to them. And that means that a lot of investment opportunities are missed because they're not profitable enough. So what can we do to heal this market failure and help these people to become more interesting for investors? And that's what we see in the next slide. You have here impact investing. That alone won't close this gap, because impact investors, they expect that they get back their capital. How surprising. And most of them, they want to have risk-adjusted market rate returns. You heard about this before. If it's in a difficult context with humanitarian impact bonds, well, and there's higher risk, they want a higher return rate. And Peter told us something as well at the end of the lower digit, one-digit internal rate of returns expectation. So these people want risk-adjusted market rate returns, 67%, and there are some social ones that are ready for below market rate returns, but still close to market rate, and only very, very few that are closer to capital preservation, but they all want back their capital. So impact investment alone will not do the trick. They all need back their money and at least some minimal return. Next slide. Björn, over. That's still me. So the big question for us is, how can we manage that these entrepreneurs are not only remunerated for the financial value, the $20 for the cook stuff, but for the social value as well? How can we devise this? How can we repair this market failure? Over to you.
So yeah, and here I take over. So the question, Peter was actually talking about externalities, positive externalities these businesses create. And we know this principle already from carbon finance. There is a mechanism in place to reward businesses for reduction of emissions, right? And back in 2016, when we were highly inspired by the whole movement around impact bonds, we started to apply the whole idea of outcomes-based finance to high impact businesses, actually. And this looks like that from the perspective of a high impact enterprise with a business case with earned income. So they might not be able to earn as much as other businesses, but they earn, right? And what they need is a top up to their revenues. So they need additional cash flow coming in as a kind of revenue, which is based on monetizing these positive externalities, so social outcomes. So while carbon finance is focusing on one specific impact, we can apply this concept also to the rest of the SDGs, right? And we can combine it with investment, coming back to Peter's explanation that traditional RBF is typically lacking pre-finance. And we are exclusively focusing on enterprises wanting to scale via investment. So the model looks like that. We have two separate contracts. One contract between the outcome payer and the impact enterprise. This is the sync agreement. In the sync agreement, it's a kind of pre-order of impact for the enterprise, a commitment to pay them for future additional impact, of course, above their projections and above the baseline. So we only pay for additional outcomes. And on the other side, and this contract has a closing condition that it only comes into force in the case that the enterprise raises investment, actually to be able to scale and deliver this impact. And on the other side, we have an investor, typically an impact investor, and we will see one case and some examples. And this investor agrees separately with the enterprise on a very straightforward investment. Yeah, and this looks like this a bit more in detail. Of course, there's also, like in any other outcomes-based finance mechanism, there's a verifier involved. But what is important to mention is also that these payments delivered by the outcome payer ongoing. It's not like a contract for 4 years and you don't know over 4 years whether you can make it. We really want to make it feel like a revenue stream, right? This means ongoing payments. When possible, of course, we need immediate outcomes based on performance and not targets. So we don't agree on absolute targets. It's really a kind of incentivizing every additional unit of impact or outcomes concretely created. And on the other side, the enterprise is actually in charge. It's not us raising investment for them. They are in charge to attract investors. And they are also free to engage with any kind of investor they want, and also the type of capital they are raising. So we have seen cases for FUNC where the enterprise did raise equity, and others where they raised debt or innovative finance, other types of innovative finance, all of course have to be repayable. So this is a blended finance mechanism. So next, oops. Yeah, here you see the suitability criteria. So what we need, and the selection is actually based on this criteria. We need a strong evidence that this positive impact will happen. It's not so much experimental where you don't know whether this is possible. You know very well that the enterprise is able to deliver this impact. We need, of course, high scalability, an immediate, like a direct link between the intervention of the enterprise and the outcomes that is expected, or proxies of that. And as Peter already mentioned, we need to see this market failure, right? The donors providing outcomes funding, they want to correct the market in a sense, right? They want to address the market failure, be it more rural clients or beneficiaries, be it a very specific target group, just addressing this directly with incentives to the enterprise. And here's an overview to compare SIPs with FUNC. We are very often asked, what is the difference? I won't go through every single detail. I think the most important learning is, while a SIP is designed for non-profit interventions, primarily, a FUNC is purely designed for businesses. And the FUNC is closer to carbon finance than to impact bonds, I would say, from the mechanism behind that. And the theory of change of a FUNC is not about de-risking and testing an intervention. It's really mobilizing the private sector capital for enterprises that deserve to scale because they are creating massive social impact. And of course, it's ODA money used for that mainly. So the capital is flowing typically to developing countries.
Okay, how does this look in practice? We have one example for you here. It's a social enterprise in Latin America, where these are the FUNC transactions we have already closed or are in preparation. So you see, it's not limited to one sector. We have examples from healthcare, from agriculture, employment and education, vocational skills development, off-grid energy, WASH, circular economy. So that's applicable to every SDG. So that's a good news, as long as you find suitable candidates, like for instance, Clínicas de Azúcar, which is a healthcare provider in Mexico. They are treating diabetes patients, and on the right hand of the picture you see the founder, Javier Lozano, and he said every person with diabetes should be treated like my mom, who was upper class and then well treated, but others are not. You know, there are many of these people that are not treated at all. Only 5% get decent healthcare. And Clínicas de Azúcar, everybody can go in and gets high quality treatment. And now we thought, what can we do together with the Clínicas de Azúcar, who is already doing a very good job? And we saw our mission, SDC, its mission is poverty reduction inclusion. So we said, look, it's how many of your clients are poor? And it said us, well, about 30%, something like this. We said, okay, would be better if you treat more poor people. The others can afford anyway, right? He said, yeah, I would love to, but my investors want me to make money, and the poor people are not paying everything, and I mean, even subsidizing some of them. And it's more complicated. So I have to move to neighborhoods where there are rich people or middle class people as well. We said, can't you tweak and twist your system a little bit and get more patients from the pyramid, at the bottom of the pyramid, if he would incentivize you? He said, yes, we'd love to do so. And so we agreed on a metric to increase the ratio of the bottom of the pyramid clients among their active patients. And the metric 2, very important, of course, that should not mean that their treatment is less good than to everybody else. So their treatment should be of high quality as well. That means that their HbA1c levels, which indicates how bad your diabetes is, should go down, and as much down as for other patients as well. So we concluded the contract with these two metrics. We said, okay, you'll get up to $275,000 if you achieve these targets over time, 2-3 years. And with this this contract under the arm, they raised 1.5 million in private investment. Next slide. And this is how it came out. Okay, I talked already about the financial leverage. You see on the right-hand side our small payment of $270,000 of incentives, but in the first round they got impact investors of 1.5. Later, the IDB gave a loan of 2 million, and I've seen others came in and gave another 4 million to help Javier to extend his network of diabetes clinics all over Mexico. During the time we collaborated, he opened up another 5 clinics, and he's poised to grow, to continue to grow. We let all these data be verified as well by an independent researcher from MIT. And the additional impact you can see here on the left-hand side is what have been the clients that come into the game additional. Because as a donor, you're always very much concerned about additionality. I don't want to finance something that is happening anyway. I want to see what is happening in addition to what have happened anyway. So it was about additional clients, more people from the base of the pyramid. Not all, not the 30%, but the 31% going up to 37% of his clients. And in every new clinic he's opening, staying on this. And the lower end, you can see over time that means 10,000 additional clients and accumulated over 10 years, you go up to more than 40,000 additional clients from the base of the pyramid. As we usually don't look about 10 years, we settled for 5 years, but cumulatively with 270,000, you're reaching out to 10,000 more clients that get proper diabetes healthcare that is life-changing, life-saving, and all this only for $275,000, 10,000 people from the base of the pyramid. So that's how it can, in a good case, work. We had other good cases, and of course, sometimes it's not working out as planned, but that shows you the potential. Over to you, Björn.
Yeah, so we started to implement SYNC in 2016, the first time in Latin America, in a program with SDC, IDB Lab, Ashoka, and New Ventures. This pilot actually got amended and got bigger and bigger over time. So we are quite present in Latin America, still quite present there. However, we also applied this and other models now in Africa and Asia. So it's agnostic to sectors and also to regions. However, we also realized that SYNC is just one way of rewarding entrepreneurs for impact, right? Because SYNC is actually if a donor is willing and able to pay for outcomes. But what if an impact first investor, one of these few who are members of EVPA, for example, investors for impact, right, would be willing and able to reward entrepreneurs directly with their finance they provide. So what we then created, we created out of this sync the practice of impact-linked finance, and we did not invent it, right? This was here before. There were already investors providing discounts on interest rates, for example. However, these investors were typically not really focusing on outcomes. It was very, let's say, pragmatic. And we thought it is worth it to define a new practice, which is called impact-linked finance, using the full range of instruments, equity, debt, mezzanine, every kind of finance that can be provided, and link it directly to rewards for impact. And this should actually be obvious in the financial system, right? That if you create massive social good, that you have lower financing costs, but that's unfortunately not the case in our system. So a very simplified example is, I already mentioned, an impact-linked loan, for example, is a simple loan with an additional term where the interest rate or even the repayment is linked to impact, to achievement of outcomes. We do this also in the pandemic as a response to this crisis, because we know that in particular small high impact enterprises, there's a high risk of emission drift when they have commercial pressure, right? And so in the pandemic, it also proved to be very effective to work with impact-linked loans instead of just emergency loans, where they know I have to make a lot of money to pay this back short term. And in this specific case, we even provided forgivable or partly forgivable loans based on achievement of impact, also funded by SDC and in partnership with impact investors. A few lessons learned, I won't go through all of them, we can discuss. Just to pick a few, of course, we know that even impact enterprises are not always well prepared when it comes to proper impact measurement and management. So it's also a clear call for them, hey, be prepared. If you want to get access to this kind of finance, we want to know your baseline and you want to see your systems, how you measure your impact. Yeah, and maybe another important point, we very much believe that technology will be a game changer for outcomes-based finance in general, right? So one of the biggest, I want to say, excuses of some potential funders is, oh, this is all too costly, right? We provide a grant and we hope everything will be fine. And with technology, we can bring down the transaction costs. Very much of the transaction cost is based on verification. And I think the long-term trend is very positive for all kinds of outcomes-based finance. Here we go. I stop sharing my presentation.
Thank you so much to you both. Peter, I love your storytelling. Nice stories about Clínicas de Azúcar. And also, obviously, this concept really meets the needs of many of the investor for impact communities, investees who are social entrepreneurs. And the idea of funding the impact that they generate, at least for a certain period of time, makes a lot of sense. And what is also, I think, very interesting about this concept is the idea of maybe potentially bringing in some traditional actors into the impact space by incentivizing impact and monetizing impact, reducing the cost of borrowing, for example, or incentivizing asset managers to move to finance impact entrepreneurs. These are all, I think, this whole range. There's a whole range of opportunities in relation to this concept, and I'm very much looking forward how this will play out in the next couple of years. Thank you very much for this presentation. We had we had some question in relation to the selection of impact entrepreneurs, impact enterprises. Peter responded to that, saying that you identify them really through various means, call for applications. They're known to your partners, Ashoka Network, I assume also. So there is a lot of sources where you can find these entrepreneurs, and you also talked about the selection criteria. So I hope the question is answered. Was it coming from Christian? If not, let me know. There was an interesting question about the impact and whether the focus on the positive impact would ignore the negative impacts in other areas. So if there was a positive impact on employment creation, for example, whether you would then ignore that maybe this company is having a bad CO2 emissions performance, and how this would play out. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about this, about the net impact, or whether it is really about the different impact areas that you focus on.
Peter, you want to answer, or should I?
Go ahead, Jan.
So we, for example, let's stay in Latin America. In our program, we run there with IDB Lab. So we always look at, in the selection phase and the due diligence phase, on the entire impact of the companies, and we do a proper due diligence, like any impact investor would do or should do, also on the impact side. And we work with IDB Lab. So IDB Lab in this specific case is performing the due diligence, and this can be quite extensive. And they're really, there's no doubt that they look very deep into all the details, and they have a very profound kind of ESG scanning of the whole company. And then when this is done, we are looking one step further. What are the most relevant metrics we would like to incentivize, and also to address tensions in the business case, like where would they like to go but cannot go because of commercial viability issues, right? So in other programs, we have to do this due diligence by ourselves, or we partner up with local partners, but it always starts with a more broader assessment and then goes more narrow.
So there's a minimum impact performance that you assume before they're even allowed to be considered for your incentive.
For example, gender always plays a big role. So we have the gender aspects as a part of our assessment process. However, it's not a killer KPI. Like, we wouldn't kick out an enterprise if they wouldn't have a woman in the board or so. However, we have some very specific criteria that can, let's say, result in positive or negative points.
Okay. So and do you have any killer KPIs? Anything where you say this is a no-go? Or is it more like weighting certain impact areas more than others?
We have a lot of red flag indicators. It would be too much to share all of them, but what we do, we have a scorecard, like a scorecard which is reflecting on the business perspective of the enterprise, because we need to be sure that they are able to raise investment. Otherwise, our whole resources and energy would be wasted. And then we have a very specific impact scorecard, also considering the feasibility to create a sync on other impact-linked finance transactions with them, which also considers how well are the impact measurement systems in place or not.
Well, thank you very much.
Maybe I can add with a concrete example, because what Penelope has in mind is, if we incentivize somebody, let's say, take care of health, and he is destroying at the same time the environment, how are we avoiding this? We have a case like this with Root Capital, whom we incentivize to give credit to cooperatives, rural agricultural cooperatives. But we are teaming up with social entrepreneurs, so they are concerned about this as well. So they are not boosting productivity as hell and destroying the soil and the environment. They are promoting as well the right kind of approach, and there's technical assistance delivered like this. So it's by choosing socially motivated entrepreneurs and together with them define the metrics that we try to minimize these kind of risks.
Thanks a lot. There is one specific question on pricing strategy from Andre. Sorry. And if I understood correctly, Andre, tell me if I'm wrong, but your question was about how did you come up with the absolute numbers in US dollars in terms of, I assume it is about how do you know how much to pay to the company in terms of the two performance KPIs that you identified, the two areas for the Clínicas de Azúcar. You had two KPIs, and the question is how do you know how much you should pay for, say, one additional base of the pyramid household that you cover, for example. Andre, did I understand correctly?
Yeah, well, my question was because you gave two metrics and both are relative, not absolute, but somehow you should come to absolute numbers at some point. How did it?
Absolutely. So the absolute numbers are actually typically available when a company raises investment, right? So then they have a business plan and they try to have, of course, they show you their performance so far, but they also have a clear forecast. So we typically take this and then we enter into discussion with the enterprise. What on top could you consider to achieve? So we have quantitative numbers, right? And in the case of Clínicas, they had a massive growth case. So they had super ambitious targets already that we knew, hey, we don't need to go now down on the level of how many patients are you serving. It's rather about shifting the whole company towards a focus to BOP clients. And if they are just close to their objectives they gave themselves, we will be super fine. And of course, we then calculate with conservative numbers internally for us, like, hey, how do $275,000 translate into concrete patients served, etc. And we do also cost benefit analysis, try to understand unit costs. It's a lot of modeling. But we feel sometimes that we also have to shift a little bit the mindset from paying subsidies for patients, like, hey, for every BOP patient you serve, we pay you $20, to more like a strategic setup for the company, that they can actually be totally free in achieving it. And also in maybe they need to decide, hey, in this one clinic we go lower on a lower rate, but in others we go higher. Right?
And practically, it's very simply, you say from 31 to 32, you get 50,000, and then from 32 to 33, you get another 50, and so on and so forth until you reach the top. So you have a cap, of course, because that's the amount we have available. And if we reach 40%, all the better for us. But we can't pay you because we have a certain amount of money limited. And same with the others. We have hard data where they are, and this was verified. With the diabetes level where you are, and that determines the quality of treatment. And the researcher from the MIT confirmed this is state-of-the-art diabetes healthcare, and it was applied. Everybody got the same treatment, really good results. In a growth case, you're going in a good direction with this.
Thanks a lot. And we, in the discussion now, we can also dig a little bit deeper into these details, because the pricing strategies are obviously a really interesting design feature in all the outcome-based financing mechanisms. And I would love to hear also from from Peter, Nicholas, and also from Max about how this was designed. I mean, Max also explained a little bit on that in terms of how it was calculated. But this is certainly an area in itself that we can dig a little bit deeper in. There's also a question now from Peter, Peter Kafeki, who asked about what is stopping impact-linked finance from growing, scaling, being adopted at a similar rate to green finance, giving the example of Tesco, saying that it has been, actually they issued a bond, an ESG bond, and which would reduce the cost of borrowing in the stock markets, and it didn't even make it in the news. It seemed to be obvious, mainstream, maybe. So I'd love to discuss this question on later when we look a little bit about how we can scale outcome-based financing mechanisms and really develop an idea about how this can become mainstream. Peter, I hope this is okay for you. Maybe not.
Sorry, which Peter was this?
Sorry, that was my colleague Peter again. He made the comment here. Sorry about this. We have so many Peters in the room. We had these confusions before. Yes, so Peter. So I would take it later in the discussion, and I'd like to move now straight into the discussion and really also cover the areas that we discussed before. For that, I would like to ask you to switch off your camera if you have activated the hide non-video participants function, except for our panelists and speakers. I need you to come back again. On stage, Björn, please also switch on your camera. And then you have to imagine, so you have to imagine the five of us are in the fishbowl, and then there are 2 places remaining. So there are 2 empty places here. And you are welcome, everybody else here is welcome to take a seat on these 2 free places, so that we, at the end, we are 7 people all together in the fishbowl. And then when you are in the fishbowl, you have the possibility to ask a question or come in and share your experience or make some comments. And I would like to invite you then, if you feel that your question has been answered or your comment has been made, then to just switch off your camera again and disappear from the fishbowl, to leave the space to someone else to come in. But before we start doing that, I'd just like to pick up on some of the questions that were raised earlier and just come back to you about, for example, the area of impact measurement and management, and in particular in view of the flexibility of the performance targets that are being set. And this is a question maybe to all of you. So we had the pandemic, obviously, or we're still in the pandemic, especially in Latin America, if you listen to the news. And so the question to all of you would be, what happened in such a crisis when you see that there are force majeure events, crisis situations, especially in a humanitarian context also, where you cannot really meet, or the impact delivery organization, a service provider, cannot meet the targets because there are some external circumstances. How do you deal with, or from your knowledge, how is it normally dealt with such a unforeseen situation? Maybe we can, Peter, Nicholas, maybe you can start. How does it work for impact bonds?
I mean, I think there are 2 approaches. I mean, ideally, the impact bond is compared against a control group. So any externalities should be taken into account by that, because the control group should, roughly speaking, suffer equally to the intervention group. But often that isn't practicable. And what we've seen happen during the pandemic in practice is that because both the investors and the outcome funders have a social purpose, they're typically willing to agree to renegotiate some of the outcomes, possibly to delay them by a year or to measure them in a different way if on-the-ground measurement proves impossible. And we've seen this in one of our impact bonds in practice, where there have been negotiations which have led to a constructive solution which takes into account the effects of the pandemic.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Max and Björn, Peter, anything you would want to add on that?
Well, I would say analytically, that's absolutely correct. I mean, those are the different paths. I think it depends a bit on what kind of intervention we're talking about. For example, in the case of the Program for Humanitarian Impact Investment, European Impact Bond, we had already built in buffers because these are very complex geographies. So we actually expected problems. We just didn't know which problems they would be, such as, not being able to do the paperwork with the ministry on time, or maybe some, scheduling, building delays, et cetera, So there were buffers already built into the program, which came in quite handy when the COVID crisis hit. And, we did actually, from a governance point of view, also at the operating committee level, discuss, do we need to review our contracts? Or are we reasonably comfortable that given the new situation and the buffers that we had pre-agreed, it still makes sense to proceed as originally contracted? And we concluded that, yes, it does make sense. But I would fully agree, you need to basically anyways pre-plan that some things may be different, and then have hopefully a level of rapport at the level of the funders, where you can actually, in some kind of governance organ, discuss these things and then decide, do modifications to the contractual agreements need to be made or not?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Does that answer your question? Those who asked the question, I think it was Andre.
Andre had to leave.
Andre had to leave. Okay, so hopefully he will watch the recording. But thanks for this response. Björn, Peter, anything you would like to add on that?
Yes, we presented the Klinika Starzucker case. It was finished before COVID hit them. I was explaining intensively that we are looking at additionality, so additional clients. So now imagine the situation, they are hit by the COVID crisis, where they can't achieve their objectives. No problem, I'm not going to pay, who cares? But imagine they go bust and they have really problems, financial problems. Then they are not only losing the impact with their additional clients, which they can't reach out at the moment to, but they will lose outreach to every client. So of course we're ready to talk, and that's what we did. We talked to them, and those that were really hit, we helped them. We accommodated, we adapted the metrics. We postponed things. We even paid something in advance, which saved one or two of them, and it made them even capable to change the business model and raise more investment. So that's the beauty of this model. We are very flexible, and we want it to be, because we are concerned about total impact and additional impact. So if total impact is in danger, of course we will try to do something if it is possible and in our hands.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I assume it's a fine line. Huh? When do you intervene because something else outside of the organization happened, and when do you and when do you think it's the fault of the entrepreneur that you're trying to incentivize? Huh?
Yeah, but in the case of COVID, or we had a case in Honduras, COVID clear. And 2 floods, hurricanes and 2 floods. Okay, that was not the fault of the entrepreneur, I'm sure.
And you said you help the entrepreneur also to perform better or to adjust to these circumstances, and that maybe leads us directly to Khadija's question. I assume, exactly, you're changing your, do I pronounce your name correctly, Khadija? Is that correct? Yes?
Oh, that's perfect, thank you.
Okay, perfect. So earlier you asked the question about external support to the ICRC, whether there was external support so that they could actually increase the center's productivity, or whether they had to rely on their own internal performance to improve. And there was another question that someone asked earlier about service providers and the capacity, and to what extent they already have the capacities. Is that your question, or do you still have another question that you want to ask now?
That's perfect. Yes, thank you so much.
Yeah, should we talk about the capacity and the role of the outcome funder, maybe also to enhance, or the entire structure to enhance the capacity of the impact delivery organization? Maybe Max, you can start, since that was the example.
Yeah, with pleasure. So it's a good question. I mean, you know, if you think about it analytically, first one is to identify the opportunity. That requires, you know, analysis, basically, so specialized consultants on the ground. Those do not tend to be internal people. Those tend to be specialist agencies that you mandate. Then you get a report, you know, if a business opportunity is identified, as was the case here, the question then is, okay, so how do we make it happen? I mean, clearly, for example, to program this new IT platform, specialist consultants again were involved. So specialist entities, service providers that deliver a certain element of the new solution. It's really like, I would say, business process redesign more generally, also in any industry, not just in the aid industry, so to speak. But it only works, of course, if you have enough internal capacity as well. So I would say here in this case, what the project did is it provided a mindset and a goal setting and a roadmap that enabled, you know, building certain features of the delivery model, or rebuilding, you know, rethinking them with external parties that you could not have done internally on your own. But at the same time, an external party could not have done it on its own either, because they wouldn't have had the insights into how to actually do this, because they have more than 40 years of experience actually serving people on the ground who have you know, mobility needs in conflict zones. So it's a yin and yang in that sense. It's collaboration, but I think very few sort of solutions that really build something fundamentally better that can be rolled out on a larger scale. We'll be able to do this purely with internal resources.
Thank you very much, Khadija. I mean, the project that EBD is also involved in the West Bank and Gaza, that is actually also an example where a lot of emphasis has been placed on building the capacity of the service providers, the employment agencies. Maybe you yourself, I don't know to what extent you have been involved, but maybe Peter can tell us a little bit more about how capacity building was part of the West Bank Finance for Jobs impact bond that you shared earlier.
Just to make a change from my voice, I mean, maybe Khadija can say a little bit from her point of view, and then I can add if necessary.
I guess thank you, Peter. I guess from my point of view, in the West Bank and Gaza, it was a critical piece actually to the project design, because there have been many of these training providers already present and active on the ground, extremely strong professional organizations, but historically have been paid to deliver training and increase employability. The link to how that translates into a sustainable job has not necessarily been embedded in the way they were delivering their projects. So exactly as Maximilian was saying, you need to assist them to have a shift in mentality, a shift in culture, to be more results oriented. And we found that actually investing in a management layer in this structure to work with all of those service providers on the ground, to assist them through that journey, to make sure that the training that they are designing are responding to employers' needs, is a critical piece to improve their performance. So that's why I was interested in hearing Maximilian's experience as part of the ICRC, how the centers improve their productivity to 80%. Did they need a bit of hand-holding? Was it both externally? Was it used through knowledge sharing internally? yeah, the journey to increase performance in the context of West Bank and Gaza, I would say, Peter, I would also love to hear your views, but I think it's very attributable to the deep manager layer we've invested in.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's been absolutely critical, and entirely agree on the capacity building element to enable service providers to play a really quite different role from what they've done in the past, and to be measured in a quite different way.
Then also receive some inbuilt assistance in a way, isn't it, through the mechanism? So that was, as you both said, was really a core element. How does it work for the sinks and impact-linked finance projects? I understand there is also quite an emphasis on capacity building and supporting the organizations.
Do you want to start, Björn? Shall I?
Yeah, so it's a bit different because we actually take the position first. Hey, these are businesses, they have to survive in the market. They have to be able to raise investment to convince investors. So there need to be a certain setup in place, and also a mindset, right? We don't need to change mindsets. They are entrepreneurs are by nature results oriented, right? It's just a question, what kind of results, right? And whether we can actually help them also to incorporate impact results more concretely. However, capacity building is offered sometimes alongside a sink when we see just opportunities. And for example, IDB Lab did provide capacity building alongside sink, but in a very, let's say, different way. For example, for Clinicas, they provided capacity building or TA funding for building up tech solutions for their business, which is not directly related to our sink. So the effects you will see sometimes later.
These are major companies, and I'm a bureaucrat. I cannot add much more. Javier, he knows his business. He had a strong team. He wouldn't have raised in so much investment and wouldn't have grown so fast. So they don't need us, I would say, apart from exceptional cases. For certain things, or sometimes like in the case which we touched upon before, that you have technical assistance to their clients, but the enterprises should be rather strong. They need to be investment ready. They need to have a proper impact management measurement system. They know their job.
Good. Thanks a lot for covering this important area of capacity and non-financial support to the organizations, which I think is really crucial. There has been a question on failures in impact bond. Penelope earlier asked about what happens if things don't work. We talked a little bit about it. There was also another question on, can the market be a failures in impact bonds? Peter, do you want to come here? Yes, you are already there. Do you want to explain a little bit?
I mean, if an impact bond fails, then the investors lose their money. That's part of the reason that they get a return if they're successful, so that, as in any risky investment, over the course of time, they achieve a reasonable IRR, but not as high as on any individual transaction. But the big difference on impact bonds is that if the impact bond fails, the service providers don't lose out significantly. The service providers may receive an incentive, a part of the outcome payment as an incentive for success, but they're not gained. In most cases, impact bonds are designed so they don't lose money if the project fails. The risk isn't being placed on them. And that's precisely because it enables a smaller, potentially more agile service providers to get involved in outcome-based structures, which they couldn't normally do, at least not at this degree of risk, given their normally low levels of working capital and risk capital. So that's the sort of general way in which failure is handled. I'm not sure whether other elements to the question I missed.
Just going to add briefly, if I may, I just had a follow-on question that kind of drops into this as well. So I like fishbowls. You can come up, ask a quick question and run away. But there's something here for me, like we're constantly in a piloting and kind of proving stage, it feels like a lot of the time when we're presenting these, be it impact bonds, humanitarian impact bonds, impact-linked finance. And I just wondered, from the panel's point of view, are we past that point, or is it still at this point where every new impact kind of transaction carries that kind of extra burden of not being able to fail in case it brings the whole ship down with it type thing? Or where do you see the market at the moment? Do you think we're getting past that point?
And that before you respond, that adds actually quite nicely to Alex's question. Alex, do you also want to join us here on the panel? Doesn't matter. You're allowed to join us as the eighth person. That's also very fine. But you asked the question, how can outcome-based finance be scaled up to reach more people, unlock more private sector finance towards impact? So Peter's question was a little bit more about where are we in the stage? Can we dare to fail without risking and bringing everything down? And your question was more like, what can we do to scale up?
I mean, I think on the can we fail and does it bring the whole structure down question. I mean, I think that in most cases, you can fail without bringing the whole structure down. I mean, social finance, for example, had 2 impact bonds for rehabilitation of prisoners released from prison, and one succeeded and one failed. But the successful one went on to be replicated at least the methodology of it got to be replicated across the UK in a standard input-driven process. And the failed one, obviously, or maybe not obviously, wasn't replicated. But I think that impact bonds have 2 potential roles. One is the testing of new ideas. And the fact that one impact bond fails doesn't mean that another impact bond might not be tried, learning from the lessons of the previous failed one, or it may just be that you decide at that point that the approach simply won't work. But I think that there's another role, which is to get agile implementation at scale once you have some reasonable proof of concept. And to answer the second question, that I think is where outcome funds and outcome investment funds come in, because they allow significant scale at relatively low transaction costs. So you're able to implement multiple impact bonds across multiple geographies, for example, without having to negotiate the financial structures, set up the SPVs and so on for each one individually. So that should, and we're seeing this with the Education Outcome Fund already, is creating a market at scale.
Thank you. Alex, do you want to add something to your question on scaling? Go ahead, feel free to expand a little bit on the question on how to scale this whole field.
Thank you, Anya, and thank you all. It's a privilege to be here with you. I mean, all of you are breaking new ground in different ways. So I always feel I'm learning. Peter did already answer part of my question, right? I mean, I did understand that the outcome funds are a way to provide scale. I'm simply wondering where these models or different flavors of these models can also help one level up from the actual enterprises, you know, with the capital providers, where there's a way to apply some of these thinking to unlock more flow, or, you know, be it banks or other intermediaries in releasing more money towards impact, right? I know that very often guarantees or other instruments are being used, but I'm not sure to a very successful degree, and I'm wondering whether some of this thinking could apply to that. That's where I was coming from. Thank you.
I think this is a really interesting question. I can already see that Björn is unmuting himself, and actually I wanted to ask Björn to respond to that question.
Yeah, so of course,
how this could be done.
I could write a book about the best use of public money to leverage the private sector, and also why a guarantee is not always the best solution, because it just subsidizes everything the financial institutions or the investor is doing, right? And that, of course, outcomes-based finance can be so much more targeted to what we are actually looking at. And there's a great example where also SDC is involved. Aceli Africa, they created a blended finance platform in Africa for providing incentives to financial institutions. They have 25 financial institutions providing loans to agricultural SMEs in 4 Eastern African countries. And they work with a whole set of instruments, from de-risking to sync, because sync is necessary also to cover transaction costs. Because if you have an unprofitable deal, a guarantee won't change that, right? So it's still unprofitable, even if you don't have a write-off. So a sync can actually also help you to have a certain level of profitability to make a deal or not to make a deal. And all these things are happening, I think, talking a little bit also from our daily practice. Our biggest enemy is old school thinking, right? And also a little bit on the enterprise side and on the current practice, it's still too easy to receive grants, right? So why should also, we are active, for example, in the wash sector. And we just feel there are so many enterprises who have the option to get access to cheap money. Why should they agree on a complicated deal with outcomes finance, right? And this is actually what the funders have to answer, right? Why are you still giving away the money for free without conditions, etc.? So yeah, I stop here.
Anja, can I come in as well on this one?
Yes, actually. So exactly. So we have to finish very soon, and I'd like to ask you that Max, to combine your statement with a final closing statement about the message that you would like to give out. And in doing so, I'd like to ask all of you who are in the room to please switch on your camera and come back into the room. And then I'd like you to continue. I know you have to leave, and so Max, you can go first. But just for whoever wants to speak out, that we just collect 2, 3, 4 insights from the participants, also what they make out of this, how they will take it forward, so that we have a bit of a closing wrap-up round. But first to you, Max, very quickly, so that we can close in time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anja. I just wanted to react to this question, which I found excellent. The question is really, what is the applicability in the big scheme of things of outcome-based financing? And I think what we've seen is it depends partially on how broad you define it. Clearly, you know, if we're talking about ultimately financing SMEs with some conditionality in order to have them serve a certain, target groups or target clients, that is something you could scale very significantly, because SME financing is something that, we all know how to do, and that it's possible. I think when we're talking about impact bonds in a more narrow sense, and I'm sorry if I introduced some old school, what I would call first principles thinking, capital markets operate to based on certain rules. You need a certain liquidity. You need to keep transaction costs within reason. There's unfortunately regulation, which makes things costly and complicated. And I think what needs to happen there is we need, on the one hand, better access to outcome financing. And I think Peter's pointed in the right direction here, outcome funding, outcome funds, that's helpful. It's one element of cutting transaction costs and accessing capital, very useful. But I think the other element is we need more readiness on the part, especially if we talk about complex geographies, readiness of the organizations who actually are supposed to deliver all of this. And again, in the work that I'm doing, I see this as one of the biggest constraints. And this is maybe where I think, Björn, we agree, old school thinking is a problem, because there's a lot of old school thinking also in the development industry and I would say in the international organization space. This is where we need to build new mindsets, new capacity, but I would venture you can only do it around successful transactions. Because if you want to excite those who are not, as everyone here today probably already converted and part of that movement, we need to show success, and we need to be transparent of the pathways to success and how to improve the probabilities. So I think in that sense, it's really exciting that EVPA is putting on this work. And Anja, I wish you and everyone, best of success in building this angle, basically, of EVPA's work with this world of development, because I think a lot of impulses are needed. There's a lot of opportunity, but I would always say, let's focus on first principles. If it doesn't work for the investor, you'll find a couple of nice people who will nevertheless sign, but we're all adults, will only sign things repeatedly that make sense.
Yes, indeed. And thank you very much for this comment. It is really a core emphasis that we want to give to mobilizing capital outside of the investing for impact community. And I think it's really important that we reach out to other new segments of the market that may be more commercially oriented, either through risk mitigation measures or through revenue enhancement measures. But let me just get some feedback from Christian, Mario, Lars, who are here with us. What is your reaction to that, and what do you make out of it? Is there something that you can use for your own work?
Thank you, Anja, for giving me the floor. I will try to keep it short. And well, also thank you really for putting this panel together. I think it's quite a very good mix of providing some frameworks and also practical examples. I mean, really congratulations to that. Well, what I take with me is, well, I have a few questions in my mind now that we won't be able to discuss this, but definitely, I mean, I agree, especially to what was discussed towards the end. I mean, how can we make it more known, and how can we become more innovative? Because I think if one thing COVID-19 has shown is that there is not much time left to continue the work we did, also in terms of development work. And there I'm really looking for new models on how to engage it. I mean, with Inclusive Business Action Network, as you might know, I mean, Anja knows it. Just one sentence to it. We are focusing on one side on the capacity building of policymakers to improve framework conditions for inclusive businesses. And on the other hand, we also, since 1.5 years, working with companies on helping their investment readiness. And therefore, I'm looking really into a new possibility for the next phase also, where we can come in with a bit more innovative mechanism and to link actually also the private sector companies' investment together with policymakers at the national level, because I think we have to see it also in a more comprehensive way. And therefore, I got some very good ideas now, and I think I will get back to Peter, or also from I mean, looking into the sync. I mean, I think it's really very interesting what you shared, and I will keep it short, as I said, but I will go back to you bilateral, and so therefore, thank you. I'm still staying on for a while.
Thanks, Christian. And Mario, a last word of wisdom from
Perfect, yes.
from Ireland. You work on Ireland mostly, don't you? Is there use from the international investing for development discussion? Is there something useful for Ireland and there for you?
Totally. Well, first of all, thank you, Anja, and everyone for this panel. It has been fantastic. Very interesting insights I'm taking today. I'm going to be very brief. For me, I'm taking two aspects: the importance of the capacity building elements, because it's a shift of culture and mindset of all key stakeholders. And actually, this is something we are already thinking in the development of social outcome contract here in Ireland. And the second one is something Maximilian also raised, and I think it's very important. We need to work in the readiness, the investment readiness of the social enterprises that are the ones who need to deliver this. So yeah, I'm taking this with me. Thank you again to everyone for the great session.
Wonderful. So let me wrap up here quickly and just to remind ourselves that it's not the last time we can come together here in smaller groups. So we'll have an entrepreneurship investing for development series prepared for you. There will be an e-talk. There will be a member-only meetup, and the same for collective impact strategies later this year. We are doing research now with the Center for Strategic Philanthropy on our members' needs and experience in engaging in emerging countries. So I think Peter is sharing that link just now. We have the Innovative Finance Boot Camp coming up, offered by Roots of Impact and the Swiss Development Corporation. We'll confirm the timing very soon. We have all the training academies offering coming up this year, in addition to a number of other events happening. So we'll follow up with the presentation and the slides, etc. It would be great if you could then also give us your feedback, so that we improve also how we organize these meetings. I'd like to thank all the speakers. Thank you very much, Peter, Björn, and Peter again, and also Max, who's left us now, for being with us, for supporting this and contributing really to this very rich debate. We'll share this after the session so that many more people can benefit from your experience. Also, thank you for the participants who stayed on until the very, very end. That was great, and it was wonderful to have you. So you're welcome to stay on a little bit and chat if you like. I'm surely going to be around for another few minutes, but also feel free and just go out for lunch and enjoy the sunshine. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I have to leave. It was fantastic. Thanks.
Thank you. Yes.
Likewise from my side. It was fantastic, very interesting. I look forward to some follow-ups individually. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and thanks for all the really great organization and facilitation. It really went very smoothly and effectively. Really great.
Thank you. And you'll have the contact details of everybody in the pack also that we'll send out, so you can connect afterwards.
Perfect. Thanks a lot. Okay, see you soon, I hope. Okay, bye.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
I could stay 5 more minutes if somebody has questions. Christian, you maybe.
Yes, actually. Do you know each other, by the way?
Yes, we met a few years ago, and I still have to link him to my bosses. So whenever I see his name, I have a bad conscience.
But actually, the two of you should talk. So if there was a purpose in organizing all this, is for the two of you to meet. I think that would be, there are some good synergies. Yes.
No, it was really great to listen to it, and well, especially, I mean, before the meeting, I also had a look at the document, and I mean, what you did with the social impact incentives, I mean, it really sounds, I mean, very interesting to me, and I'm really seriously, I mean, I want to like to learn more actually about it, and see what we could learn from it for IBAN or for GIZ. I mean, in terms of how to approach the whole topic in a different way, because I mean, one question that